He battled the Boers in South Africa and the dervishes along the Nile, but never had his country faced a foe like Nazi Germany. For Winston Churchill, these were the years of blood and tears and sweat, the years in which he would lead England to victory. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. Throughout his long career, Winston Churchill was several times accused of being a pessimist, a warmonger. But when the battle came to be, in the bloody years between 1942 and 1945, few leaders were as prepared. Churchill led his nation through one key conflict after another: the assault on Sicily, the D-Day invasion, the battle for France. And if his public inspirational role was crucial, Churchill played an important role out of the public eye as well, prodding and shaping the war plans, even proposing a last-minute alternative to the Normandy invasion. What follows is a behind-the-scenes glimpse of Churchill at work as the Allied forces were beginning to close in on Nazi Germany. Join us now with Winston Churchill on the road to victory.
In January 1943, Churchill flew to North Africa to greet the victor of Alamein, General Bernard Montgomery, and to celebrate the defeat of Rommel by the Eighth Army.
The man who had fought as a subaltern in the Middle East 40 years earlier was more than a little proud to be among the soldiers who had won victory in the desert. He told them that his directive to General Montgomery, brief and very much to the point, had been, "Sweep Rommel out of Africa." The Eighth Army had done so.
In Tripoli, Churchill took the salute at the first victory parade of the war. The Desert Army had proved to the world that the invincible German war machine could be defeated.
It was an awfully good parade. It was astonishing that these soldiery could emerge from the desert looking so superb. I mean, their kit, obviously a new issue for the parade, I should think. Both the New Zealanders and the 51st Highland Division, who did the two marches past Churchill and Alex and Montier, etc., they did march absolutely superbly. Churchill was obviously very moved, so he stood there with the tears pouring down his cheeks while he watched this. It was very moving for everybody.
The final victory in North Africa took longer than Churchill expected. It had taken 6 months from Alamein to the surrender of all German and Italian forces in North Africa. The sense of victory was in the air, Churchill recalled. Britain was now master of the North African shores.
The African war is over. Mussolini's African empire and Corporal Hitler's strategy are alike exploding. The proud German army has once again proved the truth of the saying, the Hun is always either at your throat or your feet. One continent, at least, has been cleansed and purged forever from fascist or Nazi tyranny. It is interesting to compute what these performances have cost these two wicked men and those who have been their tools or their dupes. The African excursions of the two dictators have cost their countries, in killed and captured, 950,000 soldiers.
Churchill told the troops, After the war, when a man is asked what he did, it will be quite sufficient to say, "I marched and fought with the Desert Army." In Tunis, German prisoners were paraded before him.
In this procession, there was an immaculate German general who was sitting rigidly, looking neither to the right or the left, officer by his side, and they were sitting there. In this German open staff car, no petrol, it was being towed along by a mule. And as they passed the place where Winston and the entourage was standing, the general, I suppose, a form salute, sort of denies right, Churchill. And Churchill looked straight at this man, and they both, for a moment, started to burst out laughing. And then the moment had gone. But it was just one of those little human touches that both responsible men, a prime minister and an enemy general, saw the ludicrous aspect of the situation at the same moment.
The troops put as much energy into the cheering as they had done into the fighting. 3 cheers were simply not enough.
On the home front, Churchill's presence was vital to the war effort. He had come to represent the country's spirit of endurance and resolution, at a time when the road to victory still seemed a long one, and the hardship and danger from German raids made life a relentless grind. But the King and the Cabinet also played their part. While Churchill was the undisputed war leader, to run the country he depended on what he called the Grand Coalition, a war cabinet of Conservatives, Labour and Liberals. He relied particularly on his Deputy Prime Minister and former Labour opponent Clement Attlee.
He certainly respected Attlee and his ability as an organiser. And Attlee was on the spot, totally betrusted too, with anything if Winston wanted to go away or had to go away. He was absolutely safe to leave Attlee there.
Churchill was the leader, made the grand speeches, the figurehead, magnificent figurehead. Attlee did most of the cabinet work. He was really managed the cabinet and to smooth over all the difficulties and troubles. He did a much more important job than has generally been recognised.
Whenever Churchill went abroad or was unavailable, Attlee, as Deputy Prime Minister, took the chair at the Cabinet and was a very good stand-in because he was as businesslike as Churchill was diffuse. Churchill wasted the number of man-hours he must have wasted one way and another was quite incredible, but that was his working method. Attlee, very crisp, precise, and got through the business very well. And there was really a very, very good understanding between those two wildly different men.
In May 1943, Churchill left Attlee in charge again to travel to America. It was vital for the Americans to commit themselves to an invasion of the German stronghold in Europe. Churchill had also to reassure the Americans of British support in the war against Japan.
And here let me say, let no one suggest that we British, have not at least as great an interest as the United States in the unflinching and relentless waging of war against Japan. And I am here to tell you that we will wage that war side by side with you in accordance with the best strategic employment of our forces while there is breath in our bodies and while blood flows in our veins.
Churchill and Roosevelt planned the next stages of the war. America would send troops to Britain for a cross-channel assault in 1944. Most important, and most secret of all, Britain and the United States would work together to build an atomic bomb. Churchill stayed at the White House. His eccentricities surprised his host.
Winston Churchill used to love to take baths, and he would do that in front of his aides, and As a matter of fact, he used to smoke a cigar when he was in the bathtub. And on one occasion, my father was wheeled in to Mr. Churchill's bathroom and had been told that Mr. Churchill was there and that he could go right in. And he went in, and he came into the room, and he saw that Mr. Churchill was in the bathtub, and he said, "Oh, excuse me, I'll come back in a few minutes." And Mr. Churchill rose majestically out of the bathtub and stepped out of the bathtub, and without ever putting a towel around him or anything, said, "The Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the President of the United States, sir."
I do not intend to be responsible for any suggestion that the war is won or that it will soon be over. That it will be won by us, I am sure. But how and when cannot be foreseen, still less foretold.
If there was a big speech, about 3 days in advance, the Prime Minister would go broody. You couldn't get him to do any work. Urgent stuff was just ignored. And he just went into a sort of daze. And then quite suddenly, one evening, at about 6 o'clock, he'd make some flippant remark like, "I shall need 2 young ladies tonight," and with a twinkle in his eye, which meant that both his shorthand typists, who usually alternated, both would be on duty. And after dinner, he would sit down, say at about 9:30, and he would dictate for about an hour, just straight off like that.
The way he created a speech was a wonderful bit of creativity. It was exactly like a director of a great orchestra. I always enjoyed it. He would march up and down using a cigar as a baton, trying out different words for their rhythm, discarding some, whispering to himself. But when he finally got the rhythm, then he would go on with the speech. And that was a moment that I really enjoyed. As I say, it was like seeing a great piece of music. People, suppose that he was naturally an orator, but he really wasn't. It came of the hardest work I've ever seen.
I remember one in particular, which he wrote himself. He didn't dictate it. He tried and tried and tried one evening, but it just would not come. And finally he dismissed me. And in the morning, he said, "Come back at 8:30, which I did in the morning. And I went up to his room, expecting to have some dictation. But he was sitting up in bed having his breakfast with papers strewn all over the room and looking very happy indeed, beaming. And he said, "I've laid an egg."
By singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by tenacity and endurance, such as we have so far displayed, by these, and only by these, can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man.
He works until the sun goes down to finish off the war.
Returning from his third visit to Roosevelt in 18 months, Churchill took the controls of the flying boat as it flew across the Atlantic.
He says that Britain's going to win. Who is that man with the big cigar, whose greatest friend is FDR? He's known around from near and far, that Superman with the big cigar.
As a result of his many travels, particularly to America, Churchill was now the subject of music hall jokes.
We've had some grand trips, but it's been wonderful. I'm very thrilled to be here. I really have nothing new to report from the States. You know, the States, that's where Churchill lives. Well, he doesn't exactly live there. He just goes back once in a while to deliver Mrs. Roosevelt's laundry. But he really travels, doesn't he? Boy, he's been around. He's been to Casablanca more than Humphrey Bogart.
Behind the humour lay the reality of war. In Hamburg, 42,000 Germans were killed by British bombers in a single night.
We have inflicted shattering damage, and we are inflicting shattering damage upon the German cities, which are the centers of munition production, which, combined with other blows, may well be the precursor of decisive events in the European struggle.
The British people were beginning to believe that Churchill's promises of victory would now be fulfilled. In London, he contrasted the optimism of the present with the pessimism of the past in a speech at the Guildhall.
3 years ago, all over the world, friend and foe alike, everyone who had not the eye of faith might well have deemed our speedy ruin was at hand. Against the triumphant might of Hitler, with the greedy Italian at his tail, we stood alone, with resources so slender that one shudders to enumerate them even now. I cannot go farther today than to say that it is very probable there will be heavy fighting in the Mediterranean and elsewhere before the leaves of autumn fall.
In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, the first step in the attack on the European mainland. It was a risky operation across the open sea. Churchill waited up all night for news.
It was a very, very tense and torturous night for him. He was so preoccupied with that night, with whether it would be a success or a failure, and I'm sure that he related it to Gallipoli, the Dardanelles, and was wondering if another fiasco could happen. But then we'd go on playing Bezique, and he'd talk about other things, but he would always then sit down the cards and talk about the young people and the sacrifices that they were being asked to make. But at 4 a.m, they came in to say the winds had dropped and the landings were taking place and that it was all going smoothly.
After fierce fighting, Sicily was overrun. Now Italy was the target.
Together, the British and United States forces have conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and a third of Italy.
Churchill was now 69, and the strains of war were enormous. The more the pressure on him grew, the more irrepressible and demanding he became.
Well, you really never knew from one day to the next what sort of life you were going to lead. And he was quite capable of wanting some almost unfindable document at 3 o'clock in the morning, so one really had to know where everything was. The numbers of private secretaries therefore increased. The tempo increased. We tried to arrange our lives in such a way that we had a day or two off every fortnight, but I can often remember periods of the war when one was working, or was on duty anyhow, for 18 or 19 hours a day. Sometimes starting, Churchill, you see, would start work about 8 in the morning, and he very often didn't go to bed till 4 or even 5 the following morning, but he always had a nice little sleep in the afternoon, when the wretched private secretaries couldn't very well do the same, because they had so much to catch up with, and also the telephones were ringing and so on.
He was so accustomed to stress all his life, he just got used to it. But I don't think there was any immediate secret. His own remark about it, when I asked him how he managed to wind down so easily in the evening when some of us didn't sleep all that well, he said, well, I just go to bed and turn out the light and say, bugger everybody, and go to sleep.
One morning when Mr. Churchill was working in bed, I was sitting behind the typewriter as usual, waiting for dictation. There was a little grey Persian cat which belonged in the flat, and Smokey, his name, He always came in to share breakfast with Mr. Churchill, and afterwards he would sit on the bed while the secret documents came out of the secret locking black box and were thrown on the bed and covered Smoky, who would be sleeping there. This morning there was a great crisis on, and Mr. Churchill was talking very seriously to Sir Alan Brooke on the telephone. And Smoky was sitting on the bed, but this morning he wasn't sleeping. He was crouched there, watching Mr. Churchill's toes, which were twiddling under the blanket. And I saw his tails, Smoky's tail switching, and I wondered what was going to happen. And suddenly he pounced on Mr. Churchill's toes and bit right through the blanket. And Mr. Churchill had such a fright, and he gave a great kick, and he shouted, "Get off, you fool!" And Smoky did a sort of double somersault onto the floor. And Mr. Churchill, who was very fond of Smoky, then saw him sitting there a little dismayed, so he said, "Poor little thing." And poor Sir Alan Brooke couldn't think what was happening, so he hastily hung up and telephoned through to the private secretary and said, "Please, will you go into the bedroom and see what I've done? I must have upset the Prime Minister terribly," because suddenly he shouted, "Get off, you fool!" And then he said, "Poor little thing." So I don't know what's going on.
As the pressures grew, so did Churchill's need for creature comforts.
He would have generally a bottle of champagne at lunch, followed by some brandy. And then he would go off to his rest. And when he came down again, he never drank tea or anything of that sort. He used to, from then on until dinner, he would sip very weak whiskey and water, or whiskey and soda. Very weak. And then at dinner, he would always have a bottle of champagne and some more brandy. And then he would, if necessary, later in the evening, he would go on with the weak whiskey and soda. But I suppose if you added it up, it was a fair amount of drink. But I never saw him in the slightest degree the worse for wear, and he never had a hangover, because when he woke up in the morning, he was always absolutely as bright as a button. The other thing I think was of great importance was he had a very good appetite. He ate a lot. And these people who suffer from drink and cirrhosis of the liver and so on, they lose their appetites and don't start not eating enough.
On the Eastern Front, the Russian armies had thrown back Hitler's forces from the gates of Moscow. At Stalingrad, the Germans had suffered their greatest defeat since Alamein. 160,000 German soldiers were killed, and 90,000 sent as prisoners of war to Siberia. In November 1943, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, the Big Three, held their first meeting together in Tehran. Churchill had brought a gift for Stalin from King George VI to mark the heroic Russian resistance at Stalingrad.
And I was there as interpreter. And when we came into the big hall, the British were already gathered there. All of them were there already.
This, of course, was the sword presented by the King on behalf of the people of Britain.
The sword in a big basket was brought in and also very solemnly opened so that everybody could look at it. And then it was taken out, and the sword was taken out and was then given to Churchill first, and then Churchill presented it to Stalin. And Stalin somehow a little bit awkwardly took it so that the handle was below, so the sword fell out of it to the floor. But immediately it was certainly Voroshilov came here, it was immediately raised. But then Stalin also made a gesture by taking out a little bit the sword, and then he had kissed the blade.
Churchill was worried Russia might make a separate peace with Germany. He also realized that Stalin had aims in Europe beyond the defeat of Hitler.
We were fighting a desperate war against Hitler. We couldn't beat Hitler without the Russians' help. It was quite possible the Russians might have made a separate peace. There were moments, there were hints of that. In the early days, as we now know, it's suddenly been revealed quite recently, Stalin was offering Hitler the Ukraine if he'd stop invading Russia. Well, that was when he was in the extreme peril of losing the whole war. Even by Tehran, it was quite possible that the Russians might make a separate peace. It was not to be excluded. And it was essential for the safety of this country to keep Russia in the war and fighting against Germany.
Churchill, once the leader of the alliance, was now becoming the junior partner. The shift in power was noticeable within the big three.
Roosevelt had realized that the American strength was now really beginning to overtop our strengths by a long way, that they were the big boys and that they were going to be the only great power other than the Russians at the end of the war. And he thought that he could handle Stalin.
Churchill now knew that Stalin would expect the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland, as the prize of victory. He was surprised that Roosevelt showed little interest in the future of Eastern Europe. Returning to Cairo, Churchill had already conceded that Eastern Poland would go to Russia for the sake of maintaining the alliance.
We were beginning to appreciate that the Soviets were not exclusively interested in the destruction of Hitler, but wanted to take over Eastern Europe for their own Soviet empire. And Churchill came back from the Tehran conference, and there was a meeting one evening in Mr. Chester Beatty's villa outside the Pyramid. And I was only a backroom boy, but at that meeting he was heard to say, Oliver Cromwell was a great man, but he made a great mistake. Obsessed with the power of Spain, he failed to observe the rise of France. Will they say this of me? What he meant was he was beginning to question whether his concentration on the defeat of Hitler was blinding him and others to the Soviet danger which was already looming over the horizon.
And he was already looking to the post-war situation, and he had a very real fear of what Stalin and the Russians intended for Eastern Europe, and indeed for Western Europe, if they had a chance.
Churchill now began to show signs of extreme exhaustion. In North Africa, he contracted pneumonia and nearly died.
Lord Moran, who was his doctor and was with them, said he really can't go on. And my father, who up to then had said, no, absolutely, I'm going on, and, fought any suggestion that he should ease up. He must have been feeling very ill because he jacked it in then and said, no, I can't go any further.
Lord Moran sent for nurses and for some specialists. And I think he was put on M&B, which was quite a new thing then for pneumonia. But he was so ill that for once he really couldn't work. Of course, he had very good attention, but I think it was his own willpower. I mean, he was determined to see the war through. And I think his willpower did as much as the medical assistance that he had. I remember on Christmas Day he had so many generals to send on Carthage, and they were all together, and not the usual sort of non-stop meetings, but they were all talking about the war and strategy and all that sort of thing. So by this time we knew he was getting better.
Back in England after an absence of over 2 months, Mr. Churchill arrives in London fit and well again. Our little island just wasn't complete without him.
His illness had in fact taken its toll. Although he seemed fit again, underneath he was still worn out.
He was rather a shadow of his usual self, so quiet and lamb-like and kind, and one longed for the old sort of roar and snap and bite. And we were all so relieved when he got over it.
Throughout Britain, over 1 million men, British, Canadian, American, Poles, Czechs and others, were training for the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. The American General Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the invasion forces, which would decide the outcome of the war.
The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them. The magnificent armies of the United States are here or are pouring in. Our own troops, the best trained and best equipped we have ever had, stand at their side in equal numbers and in true comradeship. And when the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe, batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
Privately, Churchill was in anguish at the risks of an invasion on such a vast scale over open water. He remembered the slaughter of the troops on the beaches of Gallipoli in 1915. Churchill now absorbed himself in every detail of the invasion plan.
Churchill thought himself a very great strategist. He was having lots and lots of ideas. He was always proposing a different strategy from what the chiefs of staff favoured. One of the reasons for this was because he simply hated having to accept the sort of what we would now call the establishment view, and thought that he was cleverer still. And he would argue and argue until he'd driven Brooke, for example, practically out of his head.
Just before D-Day, when all the plans were laid, Churchill came up with an alternative to the landings in Normandy. This proved the ultimate provocation for General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff.
Churchill, quite suddenly, late one evening, said to whoever was with him at the time, "Why are we doing this? Why are we going to throw away the lives of hundreds of thousands of our young men once again in invading the coast of France? Why don't we approach occupied France through the territory of our oldest ally, Portugal, which was, of course, neutral?" So there was, I think, a rather stunned silence as to whether this inquiry was seriously intended, but it was, and Churchill said that he wished to hear the chiefs of staff upon this subject. And Alan Brooke couldn't believe it at first. He was absolutely furious that he was to be invited to speak to this, as he saw it, total irrelevance. And he said to his briefer, "Do you know that, the Pyrenees? I do. I spent my boyhood there," which he had. "I know every track, every road. It's completely and absolutely absurd and impossible, leaving on one side the political issues of invading a neutral country and opening up a completely new theatre of operations." Well, that's what the Prime Minister wants. So Alan Brooke said, "Very well, then he shall get it." And all through that night, the planning staff was set to working out a perfectly rational statement of the pros and the cons and the difficulties and the logistic problems which would arise from such an operation, such an expedition. And next morning, Churchill adverted to this point, and Alan Brooke said, "Right, Prime Minister." And he then gave a completely cool, objective, factual account of the pros and cons. There weren't any pros, but all the cons, well set out for some time. And when he'd finished that, which was faultless, he, as it were, closed the file, and he looked at Churchill and he said, "Now, Prime Minister, I'm going to tell you what I think about your wasting of the time of my staff on absurd and irresponsible irrelevancies of that kind at a time when we're trying to conduct the war according to principles which we have all, you not least, established and agreed for some time, and really went for him." But nevertheless, one of the great things about Churchill was that he did, in the last resort, never overrule his chiefs of staff on a matter where professionally they were, as it were, doing their own duty.
He was a man with imagination of a remarkable kind, constant flow of ideas, some of which were brilliant, some of which were not so good. On the other hand, he used to try his ideas out on everybody, and sometimes people thought that he'd gone mad and was proposing to do something totally idiotic. All he was actually doing was to fly a kite and see how people reacted.
Alan Brooke used to say what a wonderful man he is. He used to then complain about him and sigh and say, that man, how can I stand it? And then he used to look up and smile and say, but where would we be without him?
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communique Number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Churchill wanted to be among the troops as they landed. He was prevented from going in a most unexpected way.
He had decided that he was going on D-Day, the landings in Normandy. And he said, I could not see why I shouldn't have been witnessed the preliminary bombardment and, if possible, landed on the beaches in the afternoon. And he'd got himself a berth in HMS Belfast, the cruiser, which is now moored off Tower Bridge. Well, one can imagine the sort of consternation this caused, because obviously it was going to be pretty risky. And it finally went up to Eisenhower as Commander-in-Chief, Supreme Allied Commander. But Ike was given very short shrift when he told Winston that he shouldn't go. He said, you may be Supreme Allied Commander, but you have no right to try and regulate the complement in one of His Majesty's ships, and I'm going. And we wondered how this would ever be solved. And sometimes when I talk to Americans, I tell them this is one of the real advantages of a monarchy, because it was solved in a way that none of us foresaw. The King heard about it, and he came down to breakfast the following morning and said at the breakfast table, do you know what? Winston wants to go on D-Day. He said, damn it, I was a naval officer. I was at Jutland. And if Winston can go, I can damn well go. And effectively, he said to Winston, look, I can't stop you. But if you go, I go. And Winston actually said, it's too dangerous for you, sir. And the King said, look, if it's too dangerous for me, it's too dangerous for you. And you're more important to this war than I am.
6 days later, Churchill persuaded the King to allow him to cross the Channel for a brief visit to Montgomery's headquarters.
Field Marshal Montgomery, I don't think, was terribly keen to have him because it was pretty dangerous. We were being shelled and so on. Churchill wanted to see what was going on. He wanted to be right in the front line. And sometimes, and later on in the war, he got pretty close to being in the front line. And none of the generals liked this, you know. This is the British Prime Minister. If he'd been killed, it would have been very embarrassing.
On the day Churchill returned from France, Hitler launched the first flying bombs, the V-1. Churchill was warned by his scientists that an even more sinister weapon, the V-2 rocket, would soon be used. He suggested a lethal form of retaliation.
He put this question before the Chiefs of Staff, but would they please now have a look at it, that shouldn't we try to stop this by threatening to retaliate with poison gas if they did bomb us with the V-2? And, of course, there's quite a bit. This is quite well documented now. It was not anthrax, which some of the accounts have said. It was poison gas, particularly mustard gas. And this was, not we wouldn't do it, but we would threaten to do this if they opened the V-2 bombardment. But no one really supported him, and the Chiefs of Staff particularly didn't. And of course, he backed down.
The flying bombs brought a new terror to Britain, greater even than the Blitz. Many were shot down, but some got through. In 9 months, more than 8,000 civilians were killed. In October 1944, Churchill made a second visit to Moscow.
I come here on a tide of hope, on a tide of assurance that victory will be won, that it will not be indefinitely withheld, and of hope that when it is won, we shall all of us endeavor to make the world a better place for the great masses of human beings to live in.
Churchill was now preparing for the future of Europe after the war. He had come to reach an agreement with Stalin over who would control Central and Southern Europe. While in Moscow, he wrote out his thoughts on a single sheet of paper. This became known as the naughty document.
Churchill took out of his pocket a piece of paper, a rather small piece of paper, where there was already written the several countries and the percentage of influence of the Soviet Union and Britain. In some cases, America was also somehow mentioned, but it was not clear. Mostly it was about Britain and the Soviet Union.
The naughty document divided 5 countries of Europe into Soviet and Western spheres of influence. Romania, Russia 90%, the others 10%. Greece, Great Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50. Hungary 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, the others 25%.
So Stalin looked at that. It was quite clear what it was about, and then pushed the paper back to Churchill. Then there was silence. No, so he said nothing at all, and Churchill was also silent for some time. And then Churchill said something like, maybe we should destroy this paper, because people will afterwards think how we so easily decided and cynically decided the fate of millions of people. And Stalin said, well, why? It's your paper. You said somebody is in London is thinking about that, so why should we destroy it? You may just take it away with you.
Having conceded the eastern part of Poland to Stalin at the Tehran conference the year before, Churchill, with his naughty document, now recognized Soviet control of Central and Southern Europe.
Churchill felt that his meetings with Stalin here in the Kremlin had gone well. He wrote home, "I've had very nice talks with the old bear. I like him the more I see him." But behind the friendliness, Churchill knew just how powerless Britain had become in the face of the Soviet bear. Churchill's naughty document had revealed the extent of his anxieties. The countries of Central and Southern Europe were soon to be occupied by the Red Army and to become satellites of the Soviet Union. At the same time, Churchill tried to preserve what he could of British influence. It was absolutely vital to keep communism out of Greece if British power in the Mediterranean were not to be threatened.
In Greece, as the Germans withdrew, civil war broke out between communists and Democrats. Churchill sent troops to support the democratic forces and to make sure Russia could not be a threat to British interests in the Mediterranean.
Perhaps it was a reaction of a tired man that he suddenly got obsessions, as he did over Greece in the late autumn of 1944. He was so determined to save Greece from communist occupation, which was very genuinely threatened, that he really would concentrate on nothing else. And the cabinet secretary and Alec Duggan and others came to me and said, we can't get any business through. The cabinet goes on, and he talks on about Greece, Greece, Greece.
And through the street battles in an armored vehicle comes the originator of this great meeting, Mr. Churchill himself.
Much to Clementine's dismay, Churchill had decided to fly to Greece on Christmas Eve 1944 to promote a non-communist government.
When he went into Athens for a big conference at the British Embassy, somebody shot at him, missed him, and killed a woman. This upset him very much. But I think you could say that he might have been in mortal danger.
Britain's military support for the democratic forces saved Greece. Stalin did not intervene on the side of the communists. This was Churchill's dividend from the naughty document. In August 1944, Paris had been liberated by Allied forces, including French troops under General de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who had led the Free French forces since 1940, now returned to Paris a hero. For 4 years, Churchill had had to deal with him as the representative of France. He admired de Gaulle's courage and tenacity, but their relationship was seldom an easy one.
The general was a very intransigent character and a very haughty one, and they did have most awful up-and-downers. But I think they both knew what the other one was for.
There was one story about his relationship with General de Gaulle, which was uncomfortable. And he was due to meet de Gaulle, and the officials around him were trying to say, sort of be patient and be careful, and he was striding up and down, not liking it at all, really. And in the end, he turned around and said, all right, I'll kiss him on both cheeks, and on all four, if you prefer it.
But all their problems were forgotten when Churchill and de Gaulle walked together down the Champs-Élysées.
The crowds in the Champs-Élysées, I'll never forget, it was a marvellous, crisp, cold day. Paris looked so beautiful that time of the year. And there was this tremendous parade. My father went with the general to lay a wreath at the eternal flame under the Arc de Triomphe, where the unknown French warrior lies buried. And then together they walked down the Champs-Élysées, and the crowds went mad. And I must say it was a most moving moment.
As the Allies swept through France, Holland and Belgium, the strains between the British and American generals began to show. The Americans now provided 2/3 of the Allied forces. Churchill had to remind Montgomery to control his resentment of Eisenhower, his supreme commander. Montgomery's lack of tact threatened the alliance and often irritated the Prime Minister.
We're at dinner in the mess, and we were about halfway through the soup course, and Field Marshal Montgomery said to him, "Mr. Prime Minister, would you consider you were in the evening of life?" And Churchill was furious, and he was bent over, sucking away at the soup, and he dropped the soup spoon. The soup went all over the table, and he kept his head down there for a second or two, and he growled out, "Perhaps late afternoon, but certainly not evening."
Whether in the afternoon or the evening of his life, Churchill at 70 was still the warrior at heart, exhilarated by his visits to the front line.
At dinner that night, one of the officers on the personal staff asked him some questions about his speeches. And I remember him saying, "I love martial music. I can never get enough of it. If you lock me in a room and you play enough martial music and give me lots to drink, I will write a speech that will bring tears to any man's eyes." And in my view, that's true. He could do that.
Now, we all stand on the threshold of Germany, and it will take the full exertions of the three great powers, every scrap of strength and sacrifice that they can give to crush down the desperate resistance which we must expect from the deadly military antagonist, at last beaten back so largely to his own lair. And I am sure our soldiers at the front will not be found incapable of that extra effort which is necessary to crown all that has been gained, and above all, to bring this frightful slaughter and devastation in Europe to an end within the shortest possible period of time.
In February 1945, Churchill arrived in the Crimea to meet Roosevelt and Stalin. He felt a peace settlement had to be agreed before the war ended. He was anxious about the fate of Poland.
After a 4-hour drive over bumpy roads to Yalta, through a countryside which his daughter Sarah described as bleak as the soul in despair, Churchill reached the Vorontsov Villa. This baronial hall on the Black Sea, built by a Russian aristocrat partly in Scottish style, was to be Churchill's residence throughout his talks at Yalta with Stalin and Roosevelt. Churchill later reflected, "We had the world at our feet, 25 million men marching at our orders by land and sea. We seemed to be friends. The three most powerful men in the world were meeting for the last time to decide the fate of millions."
Roosevelt was a sick man. He had only weeks to live.
I was quite shocked when I saw President Roosevelt at Yalta. He looked to me as though he was a dying man then. He'd lost weight, he'd lost any colour that he might have had. He looked as sick as I have seen anyone look.
The big three met at the Livadia Palace, once the summer residence of the Russian Tsar. Stalin's aim was to get the British and Americans to recognize Russian control of Central Europe. Roosevelt wanted Russian support to defeat Japan. Churchill wanted the best agreement he could get on Poland.
Churchill had moved away, as Roosevelt had, from their initial suspicion and hostility into a sort of feeling of we're all comrades together. And they had this rather fantastic idea that if you treat, by that time he was being called Uncle Joe, which is almost an affectionate term. If you treated Uncle Joe like a member of the club, one day he'd behave like one, which I always felt was a rather false assumption because he had a club of his own and didn't want to be a country member of ours. But still, that had been the approach and was still Roosevelt's approach at the time of Yalta.
So the conference began in a friendly way. Stalin agreed to support Roosevelt in the war against Japan. He even agreed to Churchill's request that France should be treated as one of the victorious powers. But Poland had dominated their discussions. Churchill fought hard for free and democratic elections there. He was later criticized for not fighting hard enough to wrest Poland entirely from Stalin's grasp.
More of a fight. Churchill fought like a... We'd had more discussions at Yalta on Poland than on any other single subject. Of course he fought.
What right have the Churchill to give my home, my parents' home, my wife's parents' home to Russia? What right he had? Churchill definitely was to blame. Because if he wasn't to blame, he wouldn't sign any agreement with Stalin. He would resist. He didn't.
Well, I asked the Pole what he would have wanted us to do, effectively. Would he have wanted us to go to war with Russia? And if so, how? I mean, were we to drop the atom bomb? I mean, some Poles think that Roosevelt should have threatened to drop an atom bomb on the Russians. He only had 2, by the way, or 3, I think, at that time, which were being reserved for Japan. But then, how could that have been done with the public opinion in America and Britain, which was full of gratitude and admiration for the Russian war effort?
As Churchill returned each night to his villa after the day's discussions, it was clear that the conference was not going as well as he had hoped.
When we were at Yalta, things seemed different from all of the previous meetings. There wasn't the same feeling of enthusiasm for work. There was a feeling of anxiety. Mr. Churchill was absent from our office for much of the time with meetings, and when he came back, he didn't seem anxious to do much dictation and record what had gone on, and one felt that things hadn't been the way he had wanted them to be.
My impression of Mr. Churchill's mood at Yalta was that he was melancholic, rather depressed. Perhaps he felt his teeth were drawn and he was not going to have much influence over affairs in the future. It was the 2 giants, the protagonists. the Soviet Union and the United States.
Roosevelt made it clear to Churchill that he was not interested in the fate of Poland or Central and Eastern Europe. Churchill was isolated and weakened by lack of American support. Tonight, he told his daughter as the conference ended, the sun goes down on more suffering than ever in the world.
He was, by then, the junior partner in that the United States had come in with massive force. And although he and Britain had been in the field longest, the tragedy of Yalta was the failing health of Roosevelt and the fact that he only had 6 weeks more to live. And he allowed himself to be flattered by Stalin, who said, look, we can resolve the problems of the world between us. We don't need this imperialist and warmonger Churchill. We can discuss the world like two reasonable businessmen. And this appealed to Roosevelt's vanity. And there were many conversations to which Churchill was not privy. And above all, what pulled the rug from under our feet as an alliance was the fact that Roosevelt announced to Stalin that as soon as the war was won, the United States would not hang about in Europe, that there would be a massive demobilization of American troops and they would be withdrawn from Europe. And that was music to Stalin's ears because he had no intent to demobilize his forces at all.
Even General Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff, had his doubts about the Yalta Agreement.
It was not long before Marshall realized Mr. Churchill was correct, and he thought that Mr. Roosevelt was very slow in appreciating the Russian threat, and I think that explains to some degree the results of the Yalta Conference. He felt that if they had bargained harder, they need not have given him anything like the control that they did.
In order to secure Stalin's promise to continue the war against Germany to the bitter end, and then to join the Western Allies in the defeat of Japan, Churchill was forced to give in to Stalin's ambitions for Central Europe. In September 1939, Britain had gone to war for Poland. In February 1945, here at Yalta, Churchill had to agree to the surrender of Poland to Soviet communist control. The Soviet Union was now a great power, claiming the spoils of victory.
Churchill's worst fears were soon confirmed. Stalin's agreement on paper to allow free elections in Poland proved worthless. As Nazi Germany crumbled before the onslaught of the Red Army, the Soviet communist grip on Central and Eastern Europe tightened. On his return to London, Churchill had to defend the agreements.
In the Yalta debate, Winston made a claim which I couldn't stomach. He said that the agreement at Yalta was an act of justice. And so I felt bound to get up and say that I couldn't accept it as an act of justice. It might be an act of expediency, but certainly not justice. And he didn't much care for this.
Now, Yalta had been in many ways a great success. I mean, we agreed on exactly how to occupy Germany, no problems. We agreed on, although we couldn't say it at the time, bringing Russia into the war against Japan, agreement on the United Nations, agreement for Churchill, which was important, on France being brought into the things. So, and on paper, good agreement on Poland and liberated Europe. I mean, on paper, if you look at them now, they're perfect diplomatic documents. Therefore, in reporting on Yalta, Churchill naturally had a tendency to describe it as a good thing. And in a way, he was justified in doing so. But as happened so often, he slightly overdid it when it came to Eastern Europe, because people naturally asked him questions, are you satisfied with the arrangements on Poland? And I think he said some phrase, yes, because when Marshal Stalin, or Generalissimo Stalin, signs an agreement, he keeps it. And that was an unfortunate phrase, which dogged him rather like Chamberlain's piece of paper when he came back from Munich in 1938.
I do think that Churchill realized it. And at times, Alan Brooke, I think, recorded Churchill as it were, gazing into the middle distance with a very despondent expression and saying we shall end this whole business with the barbarians in the heart of Europe.
The sad irony for Great Britain was that although they had won the war, they would lose the peace. The sun was starting to set on the British Empire and on Winston Churchill. But as we'll see in our next episode, even as his opponents were counting him out, the feisty Churchill had a few final surprises in store. I'm Peter Graves for A&E. Until next time on Biography.